Hello everybody, this is your review session for human ecology and health, which I'm going to try and do in two sessions. I'm just about to try and share my screen with you, so I'm hoping that that will happen. And as I say, I'm going to do this in about 2 sessions, I think. Just a word about the exam. As you know, it's worth 45% of your overall mark. There are 46 questions, and there are 39 general questions and 7 questions about microbiology or toxicology. They are all short answer questions and worth between half a mark and 3 marks. And you've got an hour and a half to do the exam. 15 minutes reading time in addition to that. And we will be covering all of the 12 weeks of our time together in lectures. We've emphasised some points in tutorials. We will also be covering the first SWAN video. So there won't be any surprises for you there. You've been given some lectures each week, and as well as you choose. The subject learning guide or student learning guide is a great guide for you too when you're doing your revision. And you'll be asked to, in the exam, to define terms and to make points about the content and give examples. So, so we're going to just quickly give you a bit of a review today. So, as you know, we've talked about the proposition that health is a function of the relationship between humans and our environments, and those environments are biological and psychological and cultural and social. And we've talked about those environments against the background of some major transitions that have occurred in over time in human history. There's only one environment altogether. All of those various sub-environments that we've talked about are all intimately connected, and it changes constantly, of course, or they change constantly. And we have engineered large amounts of our natural environment by farming and building industrial centres and creating a built environment, and that has impacted on our health, which is what this subject is all about. We did talk about some ecological principles as defined by Capra. We talked about nested systems, so those systems that are nested within other systems. Each is individual but is ultimately integrated as a whole at the same time and part of larger systems. We talked about networks, and we've explained the connection between various nodes and points in networks and about those connections. We've talked about development. In particular, we've talked about evolution. We've talked about dynamic balance and homeostasis, and the fact that a community maintains a relatively steady state, or can, against constant fluctuations. And of course, we've talked about cycles as well. When we talk about balance or dynamic balance or homeostasis, we talk about, as I said, those constant fluctuations in all organisms, and there are 2 very important elements in maintaining that balance, and one is negative feedback, as I've said there, and that really is about negating the difference between the set point and what is, and the set point is normal. So, and disease can result from a disruption of homeostasis. So if you or an organism of any sort is unwell or sick, that mechanism does not necessarily work. We've talked about cycles a great deal, and for your exam you will need to be able to talk about 2 cycles we've got. So you'll see here the carbon cycle, for example, where plant cells, I should say, trap the sun's energy and store that energy as carbohydrates, and they give off oxygen. So animal cells consume the carbohydrates, and in that process strip out the oxygen and give off CO2 and water. And then as part of this cycle, animal wastes are then used by the plants for carbohydrate synthesis. And so humans and animal wastes are resynthesized by plants into carbohydrates, and also amino acids and proteins and fats, utilising the energy from the sun. So the sun is the thing that drives this cycle. So carbon and water and nitrogen and other vital substances are constantly cycled through the environment, including humans. And as I said, disruption to the flow of materials, which is what this is about, could be mean an accumulation of waste. So greenhouse gases, or a shortage of food, or a surplus of fertilizers, or an accumulation of toxic wastes can occur if there's a disruption. So we are totally dependent on these cycles, and disruption could compromise our health. One of the other cycles we talked about is the hydrological cycle. Remember that the all water on the planet, or water on the planet, is finite. We don't create water; it is always recycled, and every single water molecule moves through this cycle. So we know that most of the liquid on the planet is in oceans, and due to the sun's heat, again, the sun is the driver, water is constantly evaporating from these oceans, carried up into the clouds over continents, and precipitates as rain over the mountain ranges. And then the water obviously flows down and back into the oceans through the soils and lakes and rivers, and some is flushed through the plants and other animals, and in that process, chemical and bacterial pollution, if there's an accumulation of those, can have health consequences. And the hydrological cycle is very sensitive to climate change, for example. And we've modified this cycle, through dams and weirs and locks and irrigation systems and so on. But it is a very important cycle that we need to understand. So we need oxygen, clearly, and there's 21% or thereabouts in the atmosphere. And what produces that oxygen as part of that cycle, those cycles that I've just talked about, the carbon cycle, there's plants and green bacteria. By and large, that's where oxygen is produced. All right, we've talked about major transitions throughout human history, and each transition has meant a change in our relationships with with our environments. And each of these transitions are still occurring, if you like, in the world right now. And there's a tendency with each transition towards complexity, and during these transitions, it's often because of the adaptation processes, which I'll talk in a minute about, can be hazardous to human health. So through these transitions, we've always had an impact on our local environment, but and subsequently that has impacted on us. But really, in the beginning, we were hunter-gatherers, and we used fire stick farming, but basically hunter-gatherers, and then we began farming. And in farming, that change in relationship, and I'll talk more about this shortly. Really, one of the health hazards were zoonotic diseases or infectious diseases you know, when we came up close and personal working with animals, by and large. And then we moved on to sort of a more built environment. We started living in towns and cities, and we had some very incapacitating diseases as a result of that, such as cholera and typhoid and tuberculosis and what have you. And then we moved on to more industrial societies, and once again some of the health implications of that change have emerged, and so we also have some chronic diseases. It doesn't mean to say that chronic diseases didn't exist in early times. They did, but not to the extent they do now. I do have to say though that inequality really commenced significantly when we started farming. And I'll talk about each of those areas in due course. So we've talked about one of the definitions we've talked about, evo deviation. So Boyden's word relates really to biological adaptation. And that really is a mismatch or a deviation from the usual evolution relationships between humans and their environment. And as I've said, in times of rapid change, many individuals do not adapt well, and so this has implications, of course, for society as well as the individual. Adaptation is a key idea that we've talked about, and this is in terms of biological adaptation, we talked about the one that fits, carries on the species. If we're talking biological, so modifying to new conditions, becoming better to the new conditions. And you will need to think about examples for open road and dead-end adaptations. So open road, those adaptations, they don't limit the future adaptability. They can be biological or they can be cultural. And I say you must come up with some examples for that. Dead-end adaptation may be of immediate benefits, so but ultimately may limit future adaptability. These can also be biological or cultural. So biological adaptation is a key idea. At the beginning of this subject we talked about due to variation and natural selection. You know, each time DNA and RNA copy themselves, there is a variation. Most of the time that can be that's very slight. Sometimes it can be quite dramatic. Most of the time slight. And some subsequent generations, so that's about the variation, some subsequent generations do better than others, and that's natural selection. So we become adapted to our environment or not, some better than others. Key idea is that it is unintentional and it takes place from generation to generation and not within the generation. We talked about cultural adaptation, and this can be rapid, not necessarily, it can be rapid. So this is the acquisition and accumulation of information. It's transition by non-genetic means, and that transmission by non-genetic means happens through things like language and imitation. We need memory, we need to be able to anticipate the future, as I've said there. So it's non-genetic means, so it's carried by language and imitation. Again, and it can be, as I've said here, it's deliberate, and it involves societal processes, and the means just mean, you know, that means are they're not genes, they're memes, and they're about ideas and behaviours. And these, as I said, can be very rapid and due to mimicking all language. And they can be from person to person, so they can be within a generation. One of the major cultural adaptations that has happened in human history is overcoming the fear of fire, and we mentioned this in particular. It can be an adaptation, or you could think about it as an ego deviation, but this really interfered, if you like, with our flight, fight responses, which are hardwired and a protective mechanism. So you'll remember our conversation around that when we're in that flight, fright mode, things happen to us hormonally. Adrenaline comes into play. It's reflex, it's ancient, it's detected through many of the senses we have, sight, smell, and so on, goes through our limbic system and mobilises certain things in our bodies. So, for example, you can be frozen to the spot or petrified. You can, your the blood vessels in your periphery may constrict, so that you get that pallor, and blood might go to your legs if you're going to need to run like hell to get out of danger. And so, adrenaline dilates your muscle blood vessels and your bronchi, and it constricts your skin and your kidneys and your gut, and so more blood to your muscles can make you run faster. And so this is really an accompanying a suppression of the inflammatory process and immune response. So in the short term, does us, we need it. In the longer term, there can be some health consequences. So a major cultural adaptation. We talked about Boyden's prerequisites for successful corrective cultural adaptation. So we've talked about recognising a mismatch, recognising that it's a problem. We do that generally through observation and sometimes through experimentation. Knowledge of the underlying mechanism, definitely through experimentation, talking to each other, language, and so on. And then the means, human and material, to overcome the particular problem or particular mismatch. And this happens through education and sometimes economic, so human and material, safer environments and so on. We need to have the means to overcome the problem. And then, of course, we've talked a lot about strong political will, the will to do something about this. And these successful prerequisites for cultural adaptation will reduce or decrease the mismatch or sort the problem out. So, as I said, corrective cultural adaptations, recognition that there is an underlying principle corrects the underlying problem. So if we've got too much, if we've got malnutrition, for example, we need to address diets. We need clean air, water and food. We need to increase equality. We need to reduce overconsumption of goods in a waste-driven world. Corrects the underlying problem. Whereas antidotal treats the symptoms, and we do that mostly in the healthcare professions, although they're in health promotion, of course. We try to prevent the problem. But it might be something like treating water, or there might be, dental caries. You will need to think about some examples for corrective and antidotal cultural adaptations. So our first phase was the hunter-gatherer phase, And this was a very long period in history. And so we were able to biologically adapt, of course, and over many generations. So, and genetic variations are expressed in different environments, but this is a long period in history. And just going on from there, it was perhaps a million years biological adaptation through the process of variation and natural selection. Hardwired, can't be altered at whim. Of subsequent cultural adaptations over the past 10,000 years are really 1% of about the time we're talking about here. And so hunter-gatherers lived and do live in a very different environment to the one you and I live in. And there's potential for a number of mismatches, of course. So often different relationships with their various environments to now could involve marriage or children, or early humans were generally healthy, remember, and it's all about the one that fits best. Low crowd diseases. There were the social structure. There was small groups, sense of belonging, and so on. That we talked about mental health and being psychological being rather than doing. The children were breastfed. Birth rates were quite low because of the suppression of follicle stimulating hormones, and so the early humans, by and large, lived rather healthy lives. The diet was had a great deal of variety, and the animal protein, when it was eaten, was high quality, generally low in salt, low in saturated fat. There was mostly gathering, and this is considered the way hunter-gatherers by and large ate in those days. It was considered really a healthy diet today. It's about 2 to 4 hours of gathering. Societal structures flat, and we've talked a lot about the problems associated with hierarchies and health. Religious structures flat, and there was a division of labour, and people talked about spirituality and that connection to nature, I think, during those times. And of course, as I've said, what messages would we have about food today? What messages would a hunter-gatherer give us about food today? Then, the next major transition really was about farming, and that was a big transition. Started about 10,000 years ago. And this really, there were a number of alterations here, and we domesticated animals and grasses and so on, changed our relationship with food in particular, changed our relationships with bacteria and viruses. So diet and infections, beginnings of inequity, as I've said, the emergence of warlike societies, and to protect land and resources. So it really was quite a large change. And nature had to be tamed. This is where technological changes started to be rather more rapid. There's no going back. We had technological fixes. We had wheels and ploughs, and we learnt to use draft animals, and we made storage pots and ovens and so on. We became quite specialised during this time, and we know what over-specialisation might mean. It might mean a lack of ability to adapt. And so this was a huge change in our relationships with the environments. One of the issues during this period was the result of this sort of farming. So in an immature ecosystem, you know, we create immature ecosystems. So we do increase the capacity for food. But during these early times, of course, we were farming animals, and children drank goat and sheep and cow's milk instead of breastfeeding in early times. That increased the population. We had to farm to get more food. We changed the diet to, you know, grass-based farming, but by and large in different parts of the world. So that changed our diet. And you know, we during this period, there was a lot of, you know, the land started to be degraded. You know, we had decreased soil fertility, for example, and that meant change in nutrients due to farming. So, as I said, importantly, you know, a mature ecosystem is one where the growth and decay are balanced, and an immature one is where we create vigorous regrowth, and the consequences are, you know, chemicalisation and erosion, decreased soil fertility, as I've said, decrease in you know, nitrogen and phosphates. You know, and you can adapt to some extent, and there's a lot of work being done on regenerative farming. But if you just keep doing what we started to do initially, we're not going to, you know, there's wind and soil erosion, salinisation, you know, tree removal and so on. And it takes a great deal. You know, when you consume a kilogram of grain, for example, you're also consuming 1,000 litres of water. So, you know, if you consume a kilogram of beef, you're consuming 13,000 litres of water. So, but farming required, you know, memory and language and organisation and large groups of people cooperating. We started to have some new rules, but, you know, one of the things, of course, is we became very adapted, or we needed new technology. We became good at new technology, and we were addicted to that. But as I've said, mature and immature ecosystems are the key ideas here. So nutritional diseases, I think we talked a lot about that. If you depend on one crop and that crop fails, you've got a problem. If you have lack of variety in your diet, you have malnutrition problems, you have shortages of vitamins and minerals and so on. And, you know, too much salt, fat and sugar these days, well, you know, we're biologically programmed to eat these because it's, you know, it's rare in the environment. Still we are, you know, biologically, you know, still have many hunter-gatherer genes in us. But we had, with this farming transition, we had, you know, shortages of vitamin C, so it leads to SCO, which is very slow and painful. Shortages of vitamin B, so we have, you know, pellagra and other wasting diseases. Shortages of protein, so we had kwashiorkor, vitamin D and calcium deficiency, so rickets, iodine. We had developmental impairment, and we had a lack of essential amino acids with one, for example, using one grain such as wheat. So, our change in relationship with our diet really happened here, and obviously health implications, and the things that go wrong, of course. You know, we had plant disease, so vulnerability again with one crop. Animal diseases, we had, you know, breathing the air of animals and we had viruses and bacteria, jumping species. We, you know, biodiversity is healthy, and as is cultural diversity, and you know, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and monocultures encourage plagues and pests. So large herds of animals all together, all locked up together, can also, you know, are susceptible to disease. So, you know, as I said, diseases jumped species, and you know, measles from dogs and distemper, smallpox from cowpox. And why did that have such a dramatic effect? Well, you know, there was no immunity, or that was one of the problems. So things can go wrong. As I say, we inadvertently created habitat for animals. Some things did really well, like mice and rats and so on. Irrigation systems, vectors such as mosquitoes did well, and so we had diseases such as dengue or malaria or Ross River fever or one of those. We increased vulnerability with a lack of biodiversity, but the people who survived, you know, that of course developed a great immune system, and some of that passed on tougher. So that's where the natural selection idea comes in, and other animals did well. In Australia, you know, kangaroos and cockatoos and so on did very well from this change. We also created, you know, occupational problems with because, you know, our bodies just aren't made for some of the heavy lifting or the daily grind that farming produced, and so we, you know, we really did create some problems, you know, arthritis, knees, hips, damaged vertebrae, and so on. All right, well, I'm going to leave that there for the time being as part one of this, and I'll check this and see if it works, and then I'll go on from there.